Hello everyone, my name is Adam Lent. I'm Director of Programme here at the RSA, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this amazing space, the Great Room, here at John Adams Street. Just a few points of housekeeping and notes before we move into the main meat of the event. Obviously, can everyone turn their mobile phones, iPads, whatever devices you have off or to silent before we start? And can I also remind you that the event is being recorded, so if you'd like to share the podcast or the video with friends and colleagues, they'll be available for free download from the RSA website in a few days' time. We're also live streaming the event, so hello to all our web viewers and listeners. And a reminder that the Twitter hashtag for tonight is hashtag RSA Etsy, if you want to get involved in the discussion online. So official notice is over. It's my pleasure, very great pleasure, to introduce our speaker tonight, Chad Dickerson. I'm sure, as all of you know, Chad is the chief executive of Etsy, the internationally renowned online marketplace. Etsy is really a truly amazing organization. It's gone from a startup to a really major global brand and operation in the space of just a few years. And I think what's particularly exciting for me and for the RSA is that Etsy seems to share so many of the values that makes the RSA a particularly special and unique organization. Like the RSA, it has a really strong emphasis on creativity, on entrepreneurship, but also on the importance of community and sustainability. So I'm absolutely delighted that Chad is able to join us today, and without any further ado, over to Chad.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks to the RSA, and thanks to all of you for coming, and all the people on the live stream. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about some of the reasons that I believe we're living in a new golden age of business, and why I think we should be more excited about the future than ever, not less excited. So to give you a quick background on Etsy, Etsy's an online marketplace where creative people around the world connect to buy and sell unique goods, handmade goods, vintage goods, and craft supplies. I became CEO at Etsy in July 2011 after 3 years as Chief Technology Officer, so I have a long history with the company. And I'm really proud of some of the steps we've taken, especially over the past couple of years, to make sure that we create as much positive impact in the world beyond Etsy's walls as possible. When we talk about Etsy's vision, we talk about it as reimagining commerce to create a more fulfilling and lasting world. So it's not just about transactions, it's not just about buying and selling, it's about using commerce to make the world better. So I think it's really easy now to see the world and see a dark place. It's easy to look at business with a capital B, and see the harm that commercial activity does in the world. And I think in many ways, as a society and as a global community, we've lost the connection to how what we consume in our lives is made and produced. The recent collapse of the garment factory in Bangladesh, I think, is an example of that, a tragic example where over 1,000 people died making the clothing that many of us wear on a day-to-day basis. And I think that this is really an example of that loss of connection and the loss of connection to how things are made. So I think it's actually really easy to be pessimistic. But if we're pessimistic, I think we lose the ability to change. So I prefer to be optimistic, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the people I look to for inspiration is the economist E.F. Schumacher, who you see here. Schumacher's writing really gives me hope. And if you haven't read Small is Beautiful, and many people have not, you should definitely pick it up. It's a book that was published in 1973, and I think it's never more relevant than it is today. So in the book, you see a quote here from Schumacher, who talked about the way we experience the world and how we process ideas and how that affects our view of the world. So if we view ideas in a certain way, if our ideas are small and weak, then the world becomes, I think, a more oppressive place. And Schumacher really describes that really well here. So I think to build a better world, we have to first create a better mindset and a different point of view and think more about the possibilities in the world rather than the limitations, so that we can work together to create the world that we want to create. So Schumacher's text, Small is Beautiful, has a wonderful subtitle, A Study of Economics as if People Mattered. So Schumacher really pioneered the idea of people-centered economics. Some people call it Buddhist economics. This human-centered view of economics is really in stark opposition to some of the economics that you see today in the world, which are very dehumanizing around sort of the industrialized economy. But I think the interesting thing about Schumacher is that he wasn't looking backwards. He didn't say that we needed to go back to a different time and to kind of turn back the gains that we've made in technology. He talks, as you see in the quote here, about the conscious utilization of that technology to fight against misery and human degradation. And I think that's what really excites me. So we at Etsy really believe in the power of business to create social good based on the types of principles that Schumacher outlined. And I think this way of thinking is what's creating this golden age of business that Schumacher prefigured in Small is Beautiful, where business is much more personal, it's human-centered, and I think the forces of the world are really realigning to make the world a better place. But it hasn't always looked this way, this sense of optimism, and I think another thing that I look to as a counterpoint to Schumacher's point of view is what I think is one of the greatest works of art in the 20th century, and that's Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which was made in 1936, just before World War II. And the opening frame says this, Modern Times, a story of industry, of individual enterprise, humanity crusading in the pursuit of happiness. I think this could easily describe many of our lives today. It could describe many of the sellers on Etsy and what we're doing today. But the film itself is kind of bleak. It's funny, but bleak. You see here Chaplin on the assembly line and the foreman. How many people in the room have seen Modern Times, just really quickly? Okay, a good number of people. The assembly line foreman is telling Chaplin to move faster and faster, and he's trying to move the widgets as quickly as he can. And the satire achieves this ultimate kind of insanity when Chaplin is working as fast as he can and can barely keep up, and a salesman for another company comes to talk to the foreman and shows him what's called the Billings feeding machine. And the idea of the Billings feeding machine is you can keep your hands moving on the assembly line, and this contraption that you see here can push food into your mouth so that you don't lose any productivity. I think we all laugh because we've had bosses who would have likely bought the Billings feeding machine. So this simple act of human nourishment is satirized here, and literally Chaplin's character is part of this machine, and he's just a cog in the machine, to the point that he eventually gets stuck in the gears of the machine. So I think Chaplin's worldview is really a view of uncertain times. Again, it was a few years before World War II started. But I think there's a certain timelessness and deep humanity, which is why we still enjoy it. We actually see ourselves when we see Chaplin sitting at the Billings feeding machine and being pushed. But the interesting thing to me is that Chaplin was an optimist, and the concept for the film, for Modern Times, actually came from a surprising and chance interaction that actually happened here in London. So Chaplin on the left, who looks nothing like the Chaplin you see in his films, was touring Europe in 1931 promoting City Lights, one of his earlier films. And some mutual friends actually arranged a meeting between Chaplin and Mahatma Gandhi, which was really interesting because Gandhi at that point in his life had never seen a film and had no idea who Chaplin was. So the idea of them meeting was really, really unusual. Also interesting is this was Gandhi's only trip out of India between 1914 and when he was assassinated in 1948. So I like to think of this chance meeting as the most chancy meeting that is possible. So at that time, you probably all know that Gandhi was leading the Indian independence movement, and one of the symbols of that movement was the spinning wheel. And the spinning wheel in India at the time, and to Gandhi, was a symbol of self-sufficiency and independence. And when Gandhi talked about the Indian people all around the country using these spinning wheels to make fabric, he referred to it as production by the masses, not mass production. So he saw these as instruments of liberation, to the point that the early versions of the Indian flag that Gandhi introduced in the early days of the Indian independence movement actually had spinning wheels in them, like literally a spinning wheel sitting on the flag. So these two people who didn't know a lot about each other met each other, and Chaplin started lecturing Gandhi about industrialization and machinery. And I'll read the first part of the quote that's not on the slide. Chaplin said to Gandhi, according to observers at the meeting, "I should like to know why you're opposed to machinery," because at the same time that Gandhi was promoting the spinning wheel, he was against mass production in factories and that kind of thing. So Chaplin goes on to say, "After all, it's the natural outcome of man's genius and is part of his evolutionary progress. It is here to free him of the bondage of slavery, to help him to leisure and higher culture." And then he says, "I grant that machinery, with only the consideration of profit, has thrown men out of work and created a great deal of misery, but to use it as a service to humanity, that consideration transcending everything else, should be a help and benefit to mankind." So in Chaplin's film, and this conversation with Gandhi was the inspiration for it, man was in service to machines, but beneath this bleak outlook that you see in modern times, Chaplin actually had hope for technology. And I think when I look at Etsy, when I look at Schumacher, I think the hope that Chaplin had is, and that Schumacher had, is what we're realizing in Etsy today. When I look at Etsy, and here you see a set of products that are sold on Etsy, these dolls holding hands, which are quite adorable. When you look at what's happening on Etsy, we see that the very nature of work is changing, and the relationship that people have to work is changing. So I think when I look at Etsy, when I look at other things happening in the economy, I believe that we're actually moving from the era of Chaplin's really impersonal, dehumanized work, where the person is force-fed through the Billings feeding machine and not really much more than a machine. And we're moving into a new world where you can spend time with the people that you care about, you can focus on quality of life, and making money and making a living can all be connected in a new way of doing business. I'm going to talk about that. So I see this as really being the early stages of rehumanized work. And there's a new industrial revolution that you see on platforms like Etsy that's really bringing people back to the forefront. So I think what's really happening is we're recognizing that work is a core aspect of the human experience, and that when you join work to other key parts of the human experience, things like love of your family and your friends, connection, the balance of work and play, raising children, we can achieve our fullest potential rather than segregating those things. So I think, again, Schumacher's vision of this human-centered economy, economics as if people mattered, is actually being realized today. And this is really in stark contrast to the dystopia that we saw in modern times. So one example is James Ward, who's a seller on Etsy. His shop is called Jim Bob Art. He's actually based here in London. Etsy had a dream when he was a child that he wanted to make a living from his drawings, and Etsy has actually allowed him to make that dream come true. And Jim joined Etsy at a time when products or when work was really hard to find, and he was doing his drawing. In 2 years after setting up his shop in February 2010, he's been able to make a living on Etsy, which is really great. And Etsy has helped him create a life. One of the things that happened to him is as Etsy allowed him to be discovered by the clothing company Lacoste, and they hired him as an illustrator. So Etsy created other opportunity besides the things that he was selling. So when we talked to James, he talked about selling on Etsy, allowing him to do work on his own terms and not having to compromise. And we hear that story from Etsy sellers all the time. So the hungry bears that he illustrates and cake-loving badgers, if you look at his shop, you can check them out, are now sold in high-profile design shops all across Europe. So another example is Jane Foster from Devon here in the UK, and she sells handmade goods influenced by Scandinavian designs from the 50s and 60s, and you can see some of them behind her in this photo. So Jane's story is very similar to many stories we hear on Etsy. Jane and her partner decided to have a child, and she was a music teacher. And she realized that to raise her child, she felt like she needed to quit her job because she didn't want to put her young child in daycare. So she decided to open an Etsy shop, and what the Etsy shop did is it gave her the flexibility to both be a mother and also run her business at home, and she's doing something that she really loves to do. So she was able to balance the work and family in a way that she could not do without Etsy as a platform. So 2 years after starting her shop, she's had more than 1,000 sales, and one of her posters is being sold in IKEA, so it's also created opportunity for her. So when we look at the work that people like Jane are doing, we really think about it this way. We really believe that using platforms like Etsy, you should be able to make a life, not just make a living. So the third story, this is Nick and Enrica from the shop Formis Berlin. They make wood veneer postcards like you see here. And I'll go back to this in just a moment. But they're basically a cross between pop-out surprises and origami on wood veneer, and they're produced on a laser cutter that Nick actually built himself. Before Etsy, they were trying to find distribution in Germany and elsewhere, and were really having a lot of trouble finding that, and they felt like their business was under threat. They may have to do something else. But they launched an Etsy shop, and they found international distribution immediately, and they were able to build a shop on an international scale and maintain their creative control. So when we talk to sellers like Nick and Enrica, they really tell us that they're able to run businesses. They don't feel exploited or used by other forces, and they're able to maintain their independence, especially in places where jobs are hard to come by. And this is the beautiful owl cutout that they have. I think I'm going to buy one of these, actually. So these are just sort of 3 stories of sellers, but these sellers and almost 900,000 more make up the Etsy community. And the Etsy community is really the core of who we are and what we do. But the online community is supported by many smaller communities. And what you see on the slide here are just 4 Etsy teams. And Etsy teams are self-organized groups of Etsy sellers who get together in different locales around the country and around the world, and also online, trade tips, support each other. Sometimes they even buy supplies together. And these teams collaborate in a way in the local world that is really impressive. So again, there are 7,000 of these teams. There are teams in London, teams all over the US, teams literally all over the world. And we, as a company, actually collaborate with these teams to essentially co-create the Etsy platform, and I'll explain what that means. We heard from the team here on the bottom left, the Italia team based in Rome, that Etsy at the time when they were first talking with us was an English-only site. So the Italia team wanted to have access to this global market, but they all mostly spoke Italian. So they created Google Docs, and they translated all of Etsy's help documents in the Google Docs. And we found out about this, and what we did is we reached out to them and we said, hey, we want Etsy to be in Italian. Do you want to translate our site? So we talked to the Italia team. We gave them the tools to translate on the Etsy site, and we were able to launch Etsy in Italian literally in a matter of weeks. So we've done that with Spanish. We've done it. We've worked with Russian teams and Polish teams. So we're literally, when I talk about this new kinds of business, we're actually creating the business together. And in this case, you see that we're translating the site into other languages around the world. So these are very localized teams, but many of the teams transcend international borders. So when I think about what Schumacher said about honoring the individual, and in the earlier slide, Schumacher talked about honoring the individual and not focusing so much on abstractions like states and things like that. This is actually where that is happening, real groups of people connecting around the world. But I think this is really exciting, and the Etsy community is the basis for our business, but we're really starting to think about at Etsy, and have been for a while, we're thinking about community in a much larger way that goes beyond what you see on Etsy, and I'll explain what I'm talking about here. So as our reach and influence has grown, this year we'll easily see over $1 billion sold by our community on the platform. We've been thinking about this wider definition of community and our role in the world as citizens of the world. And we want to build a business that has broader impact than just what you see on Etsy. And I think this is the seed for something much larger. So we've been working with our teams around the world to look at how we can leverage a platform like Etsy to help address even bigger systemic challenges. And I'll talk about one here. So here you see in August of last year a tweet from Larry Morrissey, who's the mayor of Rockford, Illinois, which is a city of a couple 100,000 people, which is just outside of Chicago. And what Mayor Morrissey was sending to me, and I'd never met Mayor Morrissey before, this is my first interaction with him, was a message saying we want an Etsy economy in our city. And as I talked to the mayor and I learned more about Rockford, I was really humbled by the mayor's vision and his desire to work with us. To give you a sense of where Rockford is economically, Forbes magazine in the US named Rockford the #3 most miserable city in the United States. So I was really heartened that the mayor would reach out to Etsy and think of this Etsy economy as a way to deal with that reputation and the actual real needs. So you'll see just below this, and this is the power of business and new platforms on the internet, you'll see that I responded to Mayor Morrissey and asked him to send me a direct message on Twitter. But I think in an even more remarkable turn of events, Carrie McDonald, who is the head of the Rockford, Illinois team, these are one of the locally organized teams, responded and said that she wanted to help. And so as I talked to Carrie and I talked to the mayor later on, they were literally living in the same community, and the mayor was reaching out to talk to us about the Etsy economy, but they had never met each other. So this global platform based in Brooklyn, New York, using a platform, Twitter, based in San Francisco, connected two people in their own communities to begin addressing economic problems in a new and exciting way. So when I think about Etsy and I think about what you see here, Etsy is really a platform to leverage human capital that is already existing in places like Rockford and around the world. So we're really early in our partnership with Rockford, but it's really already a win. I think the fact that if we only connected these two people in a local community to have this conversation, we've already won. So what you see here is, I mentioned that we started talking, and as we talked, we came up with a partnership idea of Etsy working with Rockford, and these are all the signatories to the partnership. So we've been working with the local community, and the people you see here are from government, education, the arts organizations, and other organizations, public housing. And what we're doing is we're launching a craft entrepreneurship program in the local schools, in the primary schools, what we call in the US K through 12, and also for people in public housing. So people who are either low income or no income are going to be taught using a curriculum that Etsy develops jointly with the city of Rockford to build businesses on Etsy, which is incredibly remarkable. When I think about it, an internet company in Brooklyn, New York, that just started only 8 years ago, working with a community of people 1,500 kilometers away, who we had never met before to address local problems, that's a really incredible thing. And this started with literally one tweet from 10 months ago. So working with our Etsy sellers and finding ways to partner with these communities, and this isn't just an online community, this is a community in the sense of the word, the larger sense of human communities, are real people living in a place together. We're working with those, and we're trying to find ways, other ways to turn our values and mission into action, like what you see in Rockford, and ways to keep ourselves honest as we pursue this vision for a better world with our partners. So one way we've done this, in May of last year, Etsy became a certified B Corp, and I'll talk a little bit about what a certified B Corp is in a moment. And in that process, we signed a document that is called the Declaration of Interdependence, not independence, but interdependence. And I want to read it here because I think it provides a really beautiful vision of what it means to build a responsible company in this rehumanized age. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we must be the change we seek in the world, that all business ought to be conducted as if people and place mattered, that through their products, practices, and profits, businesses should aspire to do no harm and benefit all. To do so requires that we act with the understanding that we are each dependent upon another and thus responsible for each other and future generations. This is a really powerful statement, and I read it in front of the company when we signed it. And when I think about this, it just reaffirms my belief that we can and we should build businesses where people come first. And when we extend our consideration as business leaders beyond the traditional realms, things like employees and customers and shareholders, to stakeholders of the larger community, really great things can happen. Etsy started on the internet, and we are on the internet. I mentioned all of the offline communities that we also enable, but I think the internet is really enabling people in ways that can help businesses commingle profit and people, and at a scale that has never been possible before. So building these networks of people is actually good business. So we see at Etsy the broader benefit for individuals is actually built into the business model. And this goes right down to the pricing. So if you list an item on Etsy and you sell it, the Etsy portion is 3.5%. That's how we make our money. But 96.5% actually goes back to the seller. And people often ask me, like, what's the difference between Etsy and traditional e-commerce? When you think about larger players like Amazon and others, these big centralized companies, when they make money, all the money goes back to the company. The Etsy business model, Etsy makes a very small cut, and all of that money, 96.5% of it, goes back to the communities from whence things were made. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So it's one thing for me to say that our business model provides benefit and that we're a values-driven company. But I mentioned that I was the former chief technology officer. The engineering part of my mind wants to know, like, how do we measure this? So when we talked about this at Etsy, I didn't want us saying that Etsy is a values-driven company just to be slick marketing. I actually wanted to test it. And so we've been asking ourselves, how do we test this for a really long moment? So business now has emerging frameworks like BCorp Certification. And if you go to bcorporation.net here, you can read all about it, that recognize that the power of business can be used to generate social good. And the way we would describe it is it's somewhat like fair trade certification, but instead of certifying a bag of coffee, you're certifying a business. It's much more profound than that, but that's the best analogy that we have. But the certification and assessment done by, in our case, B-Lab, which are the people behind bcorporation.net, is a really rigorous third-party independent assessment of how your business measures up in terms of values. And they test you on how you treat employees, how you treat your community, and also your performance in terms of the environment. So the B Corp certification has really enabled us to test ourselves to make sure that the values that we say we hold are actually values that appear in practice. And it's important to note that this movement isn't just limited to the US. The US is kind of in the lead here, but right now there are 8 certified B Corps in the EU, across the EU, and there are 3 B Corps here in the UK. But I think that's going to really accelerate a lot. I talked to the B Labs people in 2012. 43 companies registered to do the impact assessment, which is the one that we did, which I'll talk about in a moment. But so far in 2013, 159 companies in the EU have done that. So it's really accelerating, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about it. So I talked about the BCorp assessment and wanting to measure ourselves. What you see here is actually our score. And if you go to the link on the slide, bit.ly/Etsy BCorp, you can see our scorecard on the B Corporation site. And the important thing to note here is when we announced that we were becoming a B Corp last year on May 9th, so it's been about a year, we actually barely made it, to be honest. Our overall score, you'll see here, is 80.2, and the minimum score was 80. So a lot of people ask me, wow, like, you guys barely passed. Like, is that actually really good? And my answer is, it is really good, because what it does when you go through this assessment process, and it took us months, and we had to really introspect a lot, we learned where we were deficient in a really systematic way. And because it's a points-based system, we were able to set goals for increasing our score as part of our financial planning for the year. So our goal for this year is to raise our score to 100, and 6 months into this year, we've already got enough points to be at 90. So the awareness that even getting a low score or any score at all far outweighs the score. And it's not really a competition. The way we think about it is we don't want to just be best in the world, we want to be best for the world. And this is one way to help measure that. So it's become a part of our long-term planning, and it's not a fad in the company, and it's something that we take really seriously, and we have a team working on that. So to give you a sense of some of the things it involves, you can actually go to the B Corporation site and read the assessment yourself. But we were asked, for example, like, how many resources do we use? How much water do we use? And we realized that we had no idea how much water we used. So we did what anyone would do. We started measuring how much the toilet flushes were in Brooklyn versus the toilet flushes in Berlin. And we know exactly the difference between how much water is flushed in Brooklyn versus Berlin. And we learned that Germans are much more resource efficient than Americans. So one of the other things we did, you'll notice there's a section about how you treat employees. We did the first ever, I think, in the corporate world, in any company, a gross happiness survey. And if you're familiar with the nation of Bhutan, they have a measure, a gross happiness index that's an alternate measure to GDP or what used to be called GNP. So we essentially did the same thing inside the company. We worked with the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was really insightful because we learned how happy people were in different locations, on different teams, under different management. And we're looking at that and starting to incentivize managers to raise the scores in their teams. The good news for everyone here is we're going to start sharing all of this with the world so that everyone else can do these sorts of things. We're not trying to protect it. So you'll be hearing more about that in the future. But when we talk about combining social good with business and people working together to build online and offline communities and the interdependence of humanity and our dependence on each other, what we're really talking about is love and protecting the things that we care about. It's kind of an odd thing to stand at a podium as the CEO of a business and talk about love. When's the last time you heard a CEO talk about love? But love is one of the fundamental forces that drives humanity, and I think drives the good things that happen in the world. And we think that at Etsy, when conducted well, that business goes beyond share prices or profits and actually extends into love for our fellow man. What you see here is a quote from Judy Wicks, who started the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies in the US. And I really can't think of a better expression of the power of love in business than what Judy says here. And that's something that we aspire to. When I think about the work that we're doing in Rockford and the work that our teams are doing around the world, around local living economies, it's all based on what you see here that Judy has said. So the photo you see here is of me in Rockford, Illinois last week with my partners in the Rockford mission that we've created together. And so I really felt like the partnership with Rockford that started with a simple tweet, started offline in a very informal way, or online in a very informal way, couldn't really be realized until I went to Rockford and actually sat around a table with the people that I'd interact with and felt a sense of connection with them. So last week, I drove to Rockford and I met with Carrie here on the left. She's the Etsy seller who's head of the Rockford, Illinois team, who said she wanted to help. I met with the mayor, who's to my right, and then with Ron Kluwer, who's the head of the local housing authority, low-income housing. And we sat in a local cafe and we talked for hours, and it was really amazing. I was talking to them about Etsy, and people were coming in and talking to the mayor about local politics, and they were sitting down with us for a little while and talking about Etsy. And then I followed Carrie to the local market where there was a special city market on Friday nights, and people were selling their wares, and I just walked around and talked to people who both sold on Etsy and didn't sold on Etsy. And it was really funny because I had driven there, and I followed her in the car I was driving, and when we got to the market, she told me it felt really weird to have the CEO of Etsy following me in his car. But we got there, and I met a lot of sellers. But the interesting thing to me about this scene in the cafe is there weren't any grand speeches, there were no gestures, no one stood up and did any sort of oratory or anything like that. It was really just people with a shared problem sitting down together around a table in a city and working to make things better in just one community, and I was really touched by that. So I think we see this kind of thing happening on Etsy every day, but it's happening when people raise money on Kickstarter. It's happening when people teach each other on platforms like Skillshare. But there's lots of this sort of amazing business happening right now. So I really think when I look at this photo and I think about that experience of last week, we're really part together, and all of you here are really part of a remarkable moment, and I think a time when we can be really optimistic about the future and about business being personal. And when I talk about business being personal, I mean devoting our energies and passion to businesses that make the world better for each other and recognize that sense of interdependence that we all know exist. I think it means not being afraid of technologies and afraid of the internet. It means using those technologies to connect like-minded people to make positive change in the world around us. I think it means science and technology in the service of art and in the service of humanity, and what we heard from Schumacher and Chaplin, making those things come true. And we have the ability for the first time, I think, ever. And I think it means using the vast technological resources we have, not to try to squeeze more out of the planet that we all live on together, but also to bring people together around a table like we did in Rockford and solve some of these problems and make things at least a little bit better. So I think in the Etsy community, with the individuals finding success on their own terms that you heard about and banding together in teams around the world, working in their local communities to make things better, we're really redefining what success means. And anyone can participate in this ecosystem and participate in their own terms. I think that in becoming a certified B Corp and in working with this larger B Corp community, this community of companies, we're really challenging the notions of what business can mean for the world. We're saying that it's not people versus profit, it's profit because you're doing good things for people, and business can make both of those things possible. We don't really have to choose anymore. When I talk about Etsy and people ask me, why is Etsy successful? Why has Etsy continued to grow? Our business is based 100% on the success of other people. So Etsy can only be successful if we make other people successful. There's literally no other way for us to be successful. Those things are tied together. And so I think these types of businesses, like what you see on Etsy, are possible in a world where people are connected on a global scale in a way that they've never seen before, and they also share common values and goals and can connect each other. So I think we're living in a new world where people are able to sell things they make to anyone in the world, anywhere, and establish a relationship. They can make money in a really fulfilling environment for the first time. We're living in a world where the mayors of cities anywhere are reaching out to CEOs like me just with a simple tweet, and teams and people in their communities are partnering with CEOs and mayors to make things better. And I think this is really a beautiful world. It's the world that I want to live in. So the sign you see here is actually from the Occupy movement. And some of you probably heard this phrase before. But when I see this, I don't just think another world is possible. I think we're already inventing that world, and the world is happening around us. So it's not something in the future. It's happening now. We just have to engage with it. So I'm really excited about where the world is headed, and I think we can make the world even better when we take this technology that we have and this ability that we have to connect with each other and make the world a better place. So the image that you see here on the slide is actually from 2006, where at Etsy we put the avatar of every seller into a large mosaic. And so each dot you see here is an Etsy seller. If we did this today, there's so many sellers, it would probably just be like a black screen. But when I look at this massive group of sellers all around the world doing amazing things, I really wonder what E.F. Schumacher would have thought about about Etsy, and I wonder what Chaplin would have thought about Etsy. And I wonder what Gandhi would have thought about Etsy, because the principle that Gandhi talked about, production by the masses, in essence is the organizing principle of what happens on Etsy, and it happens all over the world, not just in India, but all countries of the world. And this is a community where, this year, well over $1 billion will change hands, which is quite remarkable. So I wonder what they would think about a company like Etsy that's part of this global community of businesses, BCorp businesses, that leverage the power of business for social good, and where money goes back to communities rather than being pulled back to a centralized company. So, I mean, this is really the world that I want to live in and want to help create with all of you. And I really couldn't be more excited about the future that we're building in places like in London and Brooklyn, in Berlin, in Brisbane, in Rockford, and really everywhere in between. So I wanted to close by saying, let's all continue to work together to make business more personal, more beautiful, and more joyful. I think we're well on our way. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for, I think it was a really inspirational and very interesting talk there. Before I open it up to the audience, I just wanted to ask one sort of big question which occurred to me listening to you talk there. I mean, to what extent do you feel that growth and success of a business is in tension with that sort of more benign vision that you have? Because, of course, many people are looking at Google at the moment, which, of course, has the informal motto of don't do evil, and yet many people are getting very worried about certain aspects of Google's behavior. Do you worry that as Etsy grows and it becomes more successful, that some of the vision that you have might be challenged, might be lost?
So I think we like other companies, have to keep ourselves in check. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about the B Corp movement and BCorp Certification, which is really just the beginning, it's not the end, is that we have to submit, we have to update our assessment every 2 years. Right. So we have to constantly be evaluating ourselves in a way that I think we formally committed that we have to keep doing it. So I think it's really important that we're not just saying that we're not evil, we're saying that we're not evil and someone else looked at us to make sure we're not evil. Yeah. So that's something that's really important to us. I think Etsy as a network of sellers and buyers around the world is unique in that as the company grows and as the community grows, we're really just a collection of smaller things around the world. So the teams that I mentioned, Etsy's grown to roughly 900,000 sellers around the world, but those sellers are subdivided into these smaller communities. And as we go to 2 million sellers and 5 million sellers, I think more and more of these smaller communities will develop underneath the larger community. Right. I think the other thing is, because of the nature of our business model, again, we only succeed when other people succeed. Our community can keep us in check by not choosing our platform if they choose not to. So I think we're fundamentally different than a business like Google.
Okay, thank you very much. I will open up to questions from the audience. We also may get some questions from Twitter as well. And could I ask everyone to wait for the microphone and also to try and keep your questions or contributions as short as possible because time is limited. So the lady at the front here, gentleman there, and the gentleman over there as well. Yeah.
I'll start with a very short question. Can you please tell us how you arrived at the name Etsy and what does it mean?
Okay, I'll take a couple more.
Yes.
Gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering how you managed to get going as a startup with big social aims and needing a critical mass of supply and demand. How did you square that circle and get some investment?
Okay. Okay, and then gentleman here.
Congratulations on your success so far. To what extent is your success defined by the artistic and the crafts community, And where could you see that business model going into other sectors or other ways outside of the arts and crafts movement?
Thank you very much.
Great.
Chad.
Okay, so we'll start with the first question is where did Etsy come from? There are many legends. And I'll give you two different ones, and you can choose the one that you like the most. One is that in Fellini's film 8½, there is a scene where one of the characters, as obviously an Italian film, says Etsy, which I believe means and so. And that sounded good to Rob's ears. Rob Kalin was the founder of Etsy. And that became Etsy. I'll give you three, actually. The second one is engineers who work on Unix systems, which is what most of the web is built on. There's a directory when you're programming called /etc, and they refer to it as Etsy. And so that also sounded good. The third one is, it was one of the last four-letter domain names available. So I'll let you choose which one. But to be totally serious, the origin of Etsy is fundamentally a mystery, and I think will always be a mystery. Thanks for the question.
Startups, and how did you get going?
Social mission and startup. So that's a really great question. How did we get funding with the social aims coming right out of the gate? And the answer to that question is, I think Etsy, while it was always a very passionate and idealistic company, didn't start out trying to be a B Corp and necessarily trying to do the types of things we're doing in community. I think it evolved over time. And one of the things that I've learned and I've been really fascinated by, there are other companies like Etsy who came to the social mission later in life. So a good example would be Patagonia in the US. Patagonia is also a B Corp, so you can find their B Corp score on the bcorporation.net website. And so in Etsy's case and in Patagonia's case, there was always a sense of mission, but as the company grew and as Patagonia grew, they realized that the things that they really cared about, like building communities and in their case, protecting the environment, they wanted to more actively use the market heft that they had to promote those causes. And in Etsy's case, we developed this with the B Corp certification about a year ago. And if you look at the day that we announced our B Corp certification was also the same day that we announced our last round of venture funding. So we tied those two things together. And the Etsy board of directors, which includes some of the top venture capitalists in the world, were very supportive of the B Corp certification because they too realized that Etsy, being a values-driven business, was actually really good for business, and they supported it as well. So it came late. We're only an 8-year-old company, so relatively late.
And arts and crafts and
right.
living.
So how could this apply to other business models? Mm-hmm. I think the really interesting thing about Etsy as a business is that it's a network and a marketplace. So I think the principles behind Etsy can apply to other marketplace businesses and network-based businesses. So in many ways, I think when you look at Etsy and you look at Kickstarter and you look at Skillshare and like all of these two-sided marketplaces, the principles of connecting like-minded people, of giving a group of people the ability to make money or achieve fame or something like that. Like those are the principles I think that can be applied to many marketplaces. So it's not, I don't think they're as much specific business lessons.
More questions? Gentleman here, and the gentleman there has had his hand up for a while. And then there was a question here as well. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chad. My name is Michael Collins. I work in and around publishing a fair bit, and two publishers who work with crafters or the crafting community come to mind, David and Charles in the UK and F&W Media in the States, who are pretty big. And they've turned their publishing models around by attempting to put community very much at the center of what they're doing. Do you connect with those kinds of businesses?
Publishing around crafts?
I'll take
those,
a couple.
Oh, sorry.
F&W, for example.
Okay.
Yes, gentleman there.
Okay, hello. What would be your view on regulations that would require all companies to label like B Corp style specifications or ratings on the products? I know it's quite difficult, but is it possible at the present state of the market? And secondly, I would like to add about the word Etsy, because I was going to ask the very first question. In Greek, it means how it's done, or that's the way it's done, so it's quite fitting. Thank you very much.
And I think there was a question here, yeah?
Can I press you a bit more on the business model? That glass and the jug in front of you, will it ever be made by somebody who's currently making little stuffed dolls?
Okay.
I'll start with that one. We'll go backwards. Housewares, for example, is one of our top categories on Etsy. So I think this glass and this jug could be made on Etsy, and you could buy these things on Etsy. So I think it's actually quite possible that those things could be made. One of the things that I'm really excited about, to go deeper into your question, is we've started at Etsy a wholesale program. Over the past 8 years, we discovered that many of our sellers were on their own selling merchandise to retailers, and those retailers were selling Etsy merchandise in their stores. So the best known example is, that's really relevant to the particular question, is Nordstrom in the US, which is considered by many to be the top retail brand. And they came to us because they wanted to put locally produced merchandise in their stores. And the category they wanted was housewares. The really exciting thing about Etsy is if you're Nordstrom's been around since 1916, very well respected, and you want to put locally produced merchandise in your stores, Etsy's the best place to go. So we have, in Chicago, Seattle, and San Francisco, we have bowls and coffee mugs and those sorts of things made by Etsy sellers being sold in those stores today. And that's traditional retail. So I do envision a world where not only can sellers sell on the Etsy marketplace, there's another marketplace where we connect our sellers to retailers around the world. So the second one.
Because there was a question about BCorp certification and smaller organizations, smaller companies. Is that right? Yeah.
Sorry, wait.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I was asking how about labeling every product with ratings so that we could be more conscious, purchasing what we need. But I think it's really difficult at the present state.
Yeah. So I think I use fair trade as an example, and that's the best example, but not necessarily a good example. I think essentially what BCorp certification does is it labels the company and the practices of the company. I think there are many people working on labeling products. I think when we think about, for example, the tragedy at the factory in Bangladesh, I do think Etsy could play a role in, and we already do play a role in providing people a sense of where the products they consume come from. So when you buy on Etsy, we don't necessarily have a label on Etsy, but you can communicate directly with the person who you're buying it from, and I think that means more possibly than even a certification or a label.
And there's a question about publishing and links with craft publishing.
Sure. So there's obviously a whole ecosystem around crafts, and we sometimes partner with those types of companies to do co-promotion on the web and things like that. So if you'd like to discuss that, then we should talk afterwards. But we do work with those types of organizations. And many of when you track Etsy sellers in the news and in publications, many of them are featured in magazines and books and those sorts of things. Okay. But we don't do it directly.
There's a couple of questions maybe from Twitter, from the Twitter sphere.
Yes, hi. A question for you from Twitter, from @Tid, is where did you study, and what did you study, and how did you come to gain such a broad knowledge base?
Okay, we'll take a couple more. The gentleman there.
Just thinking about your sort of social outreach plans for the future, do you have any sort of way of getting into communities and helping them think about what they could start to create and develop that you could then go on and sell?
Okay. And then the gentleman there has had his hand up for a while, and I will promise I will come to both of you straight afterwards. Is
it a way of lifting developing countries out of poverty when they can actually sell direct to the developed world?
Great question. So we'll start with where did I study? I studied at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and I mentioned that I was a chief technology officer, and I was fortunate enough to work on the first newspaper in the United States that was a daily on the web, which started in 1993. But before that, I was at Duke, and I was a English lit major, and I studied Shakespeare. So perfect preparation for a technology job. But the reason I went to work at that first newspaper is because I was really fascinated by publishing and the ability to reach people and tell stories and that sort of thing. And the reason I learned how to code and became a technology person is I realized sort of understanding how the machine worked allowed me to start publishing myself and impact in a much greater way. And I would say the knowledge, I think, comes from honestly having a liberal arts education. I think, at least in the US, there's a lot of talk about, and I'm sure around the world, a lot of talk about science and math education and people becoming engineers and scientists. I think it's odd for me to say this as the CEO of a technology-based company, but I think that's really short-sighted, and that we need to encourage people to understand science and math and literature and art and all of those things together. When I think about possibly the greatest technology company in the history of the world, Apple Computer, what they did, I think, is they merged art and design and technology in a way that no one had ever seen before. So I think we can all learn from that. But I spend a lot of time in libraries and know how to do research. The second question was?
There was a question about developing, social outreach and then developing ideas.
To community. So I have to say, when I described the Rockford interaction, I can't say that I knew that our local communities, our local teams are really important, and we worked with them on a number of different things, but I never thought about working with those teams to improve the larger community. So our work with Rockford is really early, but I see it's really inspired me, and it's made me think differently about how to engage local communities. So it's developing. But we've had other people have heard about Rockford and come to us. Absolutely. I think it's really important to note, I think Etsy as a company is very open. So there are a lot of companies where a mayor of a city could tweet to the CEO and they would never respond. And I responded as quickly as I could.
And then I think there was a really interesting question actually about economic impact of direct sell on developing economies.
Yes, economic impact in developing countries. This is something that we've begun to think about. And we're excited about the possibilities. I think they're a few years out. Etsy as an internet platform ultimately depends on people being able to connect to the internet and buy and sell. But one of the things that we've done is to kind of test some of our assumptions is we've worked with artisans in Alaska, native artisans, and set up some of their Etsy shops. And in many ways, the area of Alaska in which we're working is somewhat like a developing country. It's relatively remote, transportation is difficult, unemployment is really high. So we're testing, but I do see a world in a few years as the internet penetrates everywhere, just like cell phones penetrated the whole world, that a company like Etsy can help people in the third world raise their standard of living and sell to others around the world. But it's very early.
Okay.
Yes.
I will take another round of questions before we wind up. So there's a lady there, a gentleman there, and a gentleman here as well.
Okay, hi. I was wondering at the beginning, when Etsy was small and you just had maybe started with a smaller group of people, how it funded itself as a business?
Okay.
Thank you. I believe passionately that there's a business case for businesses to behave in the way which you're advocating. And clearly it's easier to put those principles into practice, A, in a startup and B, in an SME, than it is to try and convert a more established or a bigger organization. But do you think that corporates are a lost cause, or do you think things like improving standards of triple bottom line reporting rules, for example, would help move them in this direction, if not to get as far as you've got?
And then the question right at the front here.
You mentioned the factory in Bangladesh quite a few times.
Mm-hmm.
They make products which are dirt cheap. Do you think you could ever compete and replace them, or you're going to have to work alongside them?
Right. Good point. So the first question was, how are we funded? So So I joined Etsy in 2008, so 3 years into the company. But Etsy raised its first venture financing in 2006. So one of the things, this sounds like a contradiction in a way, but one of the things that really excites me about Etsy is we're a traditional Silicon Valley-like venture-backed company. And we've raised $91 million, and our backers include people who've backed Facebook and Twitter and all of these things. So one of the things that I want to prove is that we can run a really honest company, we can be really transparent, we can deliver returns to our investors, and we can produce value in the world, because I think the more that you can align all of those things, the more businesses like Etsy, I think, will be funded in the future and be able to grow and produce good in the world. So we're, in many ways, if you look at us, we're funded just like Facebook, Twitter, all of those companies. Second question was about corporations. Are corporations a lost cause? And nothing's a lost cause, I would say. But I do think traditional corporations have a set of challenges. One of the things that we talk about inside Etsy is we see what we're doing as a B Corp, where the value we create as a company, the financial value, is inherently tied to the social value of the company. We see that as a grand improvement over traditional CSR programs like corporate social responsibility, where you build a company, you make a lot of money over here, and then you do some nice stuff over here to try to make up for the bad stuff you did over here. But I do think one of the huge hopes there is, I didn't go into this in the presentation, but part of the B Corp movement is there's a movement in the United States for what are called benefit corporations. And benefit corporations, and this is where B Corp comes from, is literally a corporate form. When you incorporate as a company, you actually put your social purpose in the incorporation, and the board of directors is held responsible for achieving those objectives around social good. And that legislation is passed in 15 states. So some of the older companies, I don't want to say are a lost cause, but it'll be really difficult. But I think over the next 10, 20, 50 years, you're going to see a lot of companies start up and become benefit corporations from the outset. And they will be held responsible as part of their corporate charter to achieve those goals. So one really exciting thing there, and I'm getting a little bit into corporate law, but most companies in the United States are incorporated in the state of Delaware, because Delaware has really business-friendly laws. And I went with a group of CEOs, B Corp CEOs, to meet with the Secretary of State in Delaware and some of the business officials and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the business Supreme Court there. And we pitched them on benefit corporation legislation in Delaware. And we didn't think we were going to get it. We were just kind of a ragtag band of idealists. And the short version of the story is the governor of Delaware supported the introduction of B Corp or benefit corporation legislation in Delaware. And the law is expected to pass and be put into effect on August 1st. So in the center of corporate law in the United States, in Delaware, you'll be able to incorporate as a benefit corporation. And that's really huge. And the third question.
The third question was about, could Etsy ever compete with sort of cut price business models in places like Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful question. I mean, one of the reasons that I think the world has gotten somewhat addicted to the cheap clothing that you see generated in places like Bangladesh. And I don't have an easy answer because I think it would be naive and probably elitist of me to say, well, people who don't have the means should suddenly double the prices that they're willing to pay for clothing. But I do think when we think about Etsy, you heard about the marketplace. I think what we're doing in this person-to-person commerce world is we're basically redefining the supply chain and making it more centered around people. And I think over time, as we get into the developing world, to get back to the other question, you can imagine a world where as technology becomes ubiquitous, that in places like Bangladesh, instead of working in a factory, you could actually produce your own goods and sell them to people around the world. And we're seeing that in some cases, like in places like China, for example. We see sellers moving from dehumanizing conditions into making things themselves.
Thank you. I'll just end by saying that the UK government produced a report on micro businesses a couple of weeks ago, which I can assure you is not nearly as interesting or as fascinating as your talk, but it did have one absolutely, I thought, astounding statistic in it, which is that if you go back to the early 70s, there were about 875,000 businesses in the UK, whereas today there are 4.5 million. So I think the sort of world of micro business and small scale business is really taking off in an enormous way. I mean, small isn't only beautiful, it's sort of ironically growing as well. So I think the work of Etsy and the ideas you've presented today are really, not only incredibly valuable, but very much part of the direction that the global economy is going in. So I would like to say thanks very much to the audience. Thank you for your excellent questions and for keeping your questions so brief as well, which meant we could get in quite a lot. But particularly, I'd like to say thank you very much to Chad. Thank you. Thank you.